Hi everybody, welcome to Module 3, titled Non-idiomatic Principles and Practices. I hope you've all had a restful weekend and are interested in a little story time today. Yeah, my lecture today is a story about the ways that noise relates to music. The relationship between these two categories, noise and music, poses itself as a contradiction. And as we see both noise and music touch, they both individually seem to fall apart. Noises fail to stay noise as they become familiar to us, and music at the time of noise's injection initially even rejects these acts as music, so they fail to become music. But in turn, we see the rejection itself fail as well, and inevitably we are left with the story of many practices and attempts that reflexively question their own nature while still ultimately existing as acts of noise music. And as we have learned over the past week, what exactly noise is and what it does or what it ought to do for us changes as time goes on. Any account of noise is thus a disturbance in what our sense of what acceptable music is based off of our listening practices. I say our here because my discussion today concerns human beings, us as listeners, our listening practices. And human listeners categorize the world into sound and noise in a pretty curious way. It doesn't just have to do with volume. It seems that there's loud sounds that are welcome, like the roaring of a waterfall, and then there are dangerous sounds that are unwelcome that may not be loud at all, such as muttering, for instance. Of course, there's also good old-fashioned loud, dangerous sounds too, like screams and explosions. And then there's, quiet, agreeable sounds too, like the whispers of sweet nothings from your lover. Our social learnings, as well as physiognomic responses to these sensations, enculturate them as something to be sought after or avoided. And different groups of individuals also seem to have different processes by which they order these sensations, these noises that we are subjected to. And this means that noise develops outside of progression. It is nonlinear, and its principles and practices are reflections on the notion of progress itself. Noise is the subject that always comes apart, and it is only expelled as a kind of understanding of a constantly shifting relationship dynamic. The various records that I've listed as part of this module and shared with you make up a very incomplete survey of noise music, the various locations of noise as it is found in artistic expression. Each record produces a specific model which presumes a kind of overall theorization of noise as inherently slippery subject, a non-prefix retroactively applied to what other music was occurring at the time. I will draw on a couple of texts throughout my discussion, but reading these I feel is less important to the understanding of the work than just listening to this work firsthand. You wouldn't even really need to talk to me at all about them in order to really grasp and harness the energy of these pieces. I think just looking at them and listening to them themselves they kind of become self-evident in what they're doing. They are all noisy, but they all are musical at the same time. It's more important to develop feelings about these things yourselves and see how you feel about them. Whether you enjoy them or not, for their artistic merit and for the sensation is a different story, of course. But all I'm really trying to do here is share some pretty weird music with you and express that through studying them, we come up even less sure about what noise is, whether we can even name it as something specific, for it always seems to exist as this changing dynamic between sound and music as it is conventionally defined at any given time. But we have to begin somewhere, though, And I'm going to begin with Luigi Russolo's manifesto. And his manifesto is called The Art of Noises. And his subsequent musical productions also kind of immediately spur off of this manifesto and are governed by the principles shared in it. Yeah, this is an excellent starting place for a theorization of sound, I think. Russolo was one of the artists who were part of a group called the Futurists. And he was an Italian futurist. And he concerned himself, along with the other artists, with the forces prevalent in their time. Dynamisms and speeds unlocked by novel technology, youth culture, increasing violence, machines powered like the car and airplane, and the industrial city as this kind of backdrop that encapsulates what Russolo considered the birthplace of noise. He says on page 23 of his manifesto that ancient life was all silence, but in the 19th century, with the invention of machines, noise was born. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but certainly a new kind of sound was definitely born during this period. For Russolo, the industrial world was humanity's new ecosystem. And as we're always interacting with our surroundings, we should treat any sounds emanating from the industrial world in the same way that previous composers and artists drew on the natural world, full of thunder, rain, waves, and bird songs. These sources were resources, and they were harnessed as material for the composer in some way. In the past, and so too with the sounds of industry for the futurists. And in order to harness these new sources, the futurists invented a range of machines that they called the intonarumori, and they were developed in order to replace the orchestra, a kind of antiquated arrangement that the futurists no longer felt reflected the actual kind of social conditions and material conditions of the current environment. They were passé, they were outmoded. And so they needed to develop a new method for making music, new machines. And these machines that they developed would be combined in different ways, hooked up into different circuits, basically, and forced to interact differently with each other, much like the components that compose kind of assembly lines in a factory. They were called funny names like hummers, bursters, rubbers, cracklers, and the like. And instead of passé musical tones, these machines would produce really strange popping, hissing, and crackling sounds. They were often inspired directly by the machinery that were growing ever more prevalent in the city. And although these sounds were pitched, they would also be specifically designed to work between and link different pitches together, creating these overtones and producing microtones all at once so that the machines would remain very, very noisy. The performers, being that they were playing these novel instruments often for the first time, even though they designed them, they wouldn't necessarily know what would happen with the different ways of playing them. And even if they designed them specifically to remain noisy, that still means that you have to relinquish a certain amount of control over the sounds produced. And especially you have to relinquish control, or you have to kind of ease up on what your framework for defining music is, because it allows it to incorporate all of these different tonalities. But they weren't really trying to avoid music altogether. it seems as if their aim was still to produce music. Because Russolo himself notes on page 80 of his manifesto that noise instruments expand the chromatic diachronic system without destroying it. So they weren't looking to completely destroy music and replace it with noise, but rather merge the two groups together and incorporate into musicality, develop it into a new type of music that incorporated the noises of industry. And so all of these noises were really mobilized into very controlled compositions. And even though these compositions didn't follow standard structures that they'd seen before, they still composed them to seek out the chaos of industrialization and produce a music that Russolo thought was inherent to the contemporary universe, and really make people question the material provenance and of their influences and of their sources, and show them that really everything came from sounds that were immanent to the world around them. And the next act that we're going to look at is going to continue kind of probing at this question of whether there is music out there in the world, and whether there is this kind of latent musicality to everything. And it's funny because even now I feel like our standard definition of music is that it requires a certain amount of human organization, but for kind of experimental acts or acts that are pushing the envelope of what music is kind of usually seen as, we'll see that this isn't always the case. And we'll see with John Cage, who is an experimental musician and performance artist, that there is a certain immanent music, or he believes that there's a certain immanent music. This next moment that I had you listen to is a bit of a cruel joke, because it is music that's just out there, and it's pretty much just silence. And the piece that I had you listen to is called 4:33. It's just that, 4 minutes and 33 seconds of complete silence. John was inspired by a visit to an anechoic chamber. When he was inside, all he was able to hear were the sounds emanating from his own nervous and circulatory systems. So he was thinking about, like, the environment that he's in produces noise, and even the environment that he is produces noise. This piece that he made, 4:33, is didactic. It tries to teach us about music that we somehow missed based off of our kind of framing of the situation, or conventions, or the learned habits of listening that lead us to only paying attention to certain elements, certain sounds, in whatever context that we are used to finding music in. But by drawing audience attention away from the performer to all the other sounds in the concert hall, it allows us to kind of maybe question our presuppositions about where music is actually located, exposing it all as kind of just social convention. The first time it was played in 1952, the pianist David Tudor was the one who performed it. The instructions are on the score sheet that there are 3 movements, and they're indicated by the performer, except that all of these movements are silent. There's nothing to them. There's no music being played. And it's noted that this piece can be played on any instrument, and it has been in the past. And what's really cool about this is that, as I kind of mentioned before, it seems as if the performer and their instrument of choice really is just a framing device. It's kind of like a locus of control or something. The music really is everything else. All the actions in the world become material for the song and are the sounds that the song is composed of. But, of course, a particular audience of listeners will not hear like everything in the universe. They won't hear the totality of everything else. They will instead have a very specific environment available to them for the duration of the piece. And that changes depending on where the piece is performed. And it changes again if the piece is recorded, and then you get to watch a recording of it. And so it gets a little silly, actually, because what happens is that you have this canned silence, this kind of recorded silence, a recorded environment, this recorded sonic environment that exists as a recording that is a particular duration long. And that gets kind of superimposed and bleeds into the environment that you are listening to the piece in as well. But the point here basically is noise, including all of the sounds made by the audience that would normally be interruptions to a performance of music, become the music. And that idea of recording a sonic environment is pretty captivating in itself, because then when you have it as a recording, it isn't just any environment, it was that environment and everything that happened in that environment. And it's difficult to control what happened in that environment. And this idea of capturing and recording a particular sonic environment, this experience of listening to the sounds of the world and harnessing them directly as compositional elements, was the crucial act undertaken by the next person that I had you listen to, the musician Pierre Schaeffer. And his record, 5 Études de Bruit, is a perfect example of this type of music that he developed, called musique concrète. Pierre Schaeffer is this kind of scientific tinkerer. He's a scientist, he's a researcher, he's a theoretician who founded Groupe de Recherche de Musique Concrète in order to continue a state-funded program for research and development of methods for using new recording, broadcasting, and synthesizing technology that were originally used for non-musical purposes, but he was one of the first people to incorporate them directly into the production of music. In the late 1940s, Schaeffer was introduced to the tape recorder, and this allowed him to record sounds as they existed around him. But instead of using them for kind of documentary purposes or for, kind of instrumental purposes like interviews, he used them in the production of music. He saw this as real music. And this served as the starting point of musique concrète, which is this exploratory practice rooted in playing around with and improvising compositionally with the sounds of the world around you. And not just harnessing these samples directly, but in manipulating these samples, the musician could shape raw sound, sculpt with it, and abstract and stretch and, change the attack and the delay, change all of the qualities of these music. And to basically take, these sounds that existed, just like a recording of a human voice, and stretch them or compress them into things that hardly resemble the original at all. These tapes were often spliced, split, looped together, superimposed, played simultaneously, offset slightly, the recording devices and the playing devices, the tape recorders and players were modified and set up into these weird circuits so that the composer could execute a certain amount of control over them, but because they're also inventors of these machines simultaneously, they had to relinquish control again. And the record of his that I listed on the syllabus serves as a perfect example of the use of these technologies and kind of scientifically picking apart what you can do with these technologies themselves. And it's this perfect example of a musical style that has a really curious relationship with noise. It addresses it directly by making the entirety of a piece of music from found sound that really you hardly have any control over at all. In making a piece from found sounds, the composer is just a recorder. They're just a handler of a recording device. And it really opens you up to not recording just a specific sound, such as the drip of a faucet, for instance, but also competing sounds like the hum of the refrigerator across the room or the rush of traffic outside of your window. And opening yourself up to listening to all of these sounds and thinking about how that they can be used as granular textures to be kind of picked apart and modified specifically in order to become compositional elements, seeing them as complementary forces, seeing them as having dynamic relationships rather than interruptive relationships necessarily, actually serves to counter our understanding of simultaneity in noise as in sound as noise, and to kind of understand the interplay of these forces more ecologically. The manipulation of these samples goes a step further in countering noisiness once again. And in structuring these samples, what you're left with is a really, really scrutinized piece of composition. It's a very tightly organized segment of music that's created from something that's very, very freeform and chaotic. And it's interesting because even though it's so tightly composed, it still seems to really understand noise. It understands this relationship that it has. It grapples with it by making the whole world once again musical. It opens us up to the potential of any type of noise whatsoever. Nothing is discarded, nothing is left behind, nothing is seen as not useful in the production of music. Everything becomes artful, everything becomes an open kind of playful exploration that you can improvise with, repurpose, and allow to mutate. So really there's a reduction of noise occurring here, but it still is this like kind of invert through itself, and it brings it back out into the world, and everything becomes music once again. And I think that this playful kind of spirit of Pierre Schaeffer and this idea of improvisation that excited him so much was really like, it was the birthplace of so many new kind of practices in music. Like almost all electronic music afterwards really was indebted to a lot of the funding that went into the development of these styles of music. But it's the notion of improvisation that I want to pay attention to, because this improvisation that so excited him would come to dominate basically all music for a while, like through free jazz and whatnot. And I think, like, while we're not going to talk about free jazz explicitly today, I want to talk about this idea of improvisation a little bit further. And I want to talk about how guitarist Derek Bailey, who's just one example of a musician who was directly inspired by this lineage of artists that we've heard so far, was involved in expanding the notion of improvisation. And he's a canonical figure in the development of noise music in the 60s. He took John Cage's endearment with immanent sound and Pierre Schaeffer's dedication to improvisation to heart. And instead of just working directly off of those, he took the spirit of these kinds of engagements and he applied it to other musical genres that already existed, or he saw that how they already existed in other musical genres with long lineages. But he also applied it to his own guitar playing. The previous idea of accessing the world and all the sounds and noises in it is less important here, but what's more central is opening up the potential of what one is capable of doing while performing with an instrument itself, which is in this case a guitar. And while these previous artists sought to reveal the essence of music by bringing into performance the sounds of the world, this kind of great welcoming. Bailey sought to destroy the conventions that existed within the institutions of music from within it. And to him, the musician, the ultimate musician, is a kind of improviser who shapes material, shapes the form of music immediately as it's being performed, bringing it right into the locale of the performance through a really kind of dedicated meditative practice. And the music isn't everywhere. Instead, the music is only in the now. The music occupies the space and time of its production, and that's it, that's all. And his version of free improvisation, that he called non-idiomatic improvisation, a kind of improvisation that existed outside of the methods of production that have a kind of internal logic that produces a recognizable standard style of music, such as Baroque, flamenco, and jazz. His version, on the other hand, sought to be both the most kind of primordial and basic, and also the most developed and futuristic almost kind of music all at once. And he attempted to flee style entirely. He attempted to flee lineage. And even though I don't think that that's really possible, because in doing that, you kind of create your own lineage. Like, he's still himself. He's still, bringing his own kind of learned repertoire, or even canceling of repertoire, into his performance. I think that his attempt is really important and really inspirational. In fighting all of these conventions that he knew, you can really hear how his flight and his cancellation produces something that is also kind of legible, which is funny. He plays in such a wild and freeform way, always alternating and shifting volume, changing his rhythms up, avoiding rhythms, canceling just at a moment that you feel like you can settle into the piece, playing with feedback and amplification, all these different textures, using these novel extended techniques that he invents on the spot. But what's so funny about it is that, like, the end result feels so kind of dead and arbitrary that it really doesn't, it doesn't sound like anything. And I guess that's the point, but like, you can hardly listen to it. You can hear it, but like, I don't know, it's difficult to pick apart because nothing is legible. And yet, like, every single one of his records kind of sounds the same. So then you're left just like listening to music and being like, oh, that's like Derek Bailey music, nobody else. But even then, some other players kind of do sound like him as well. But playing in this freeform manner is so distant from what was considered music and what musicians were really allowed to do. And I think what's important is that it takes music outside of time and places it in this kind of super now moment, this very present moment, and it frees it from its lineages in an act of confrontation, a really direct confrontation. It focuses us. And this idea of confrontation, I think, is really important. And it gets more extreme as noise music develops. And the next album that I had you listen to, Hanatarash's 2, is like pure confrontation. It's ridiculous. I really don't have very much to say about this band, except that they're like really, really extreme in their nature. And they use all these different types of instruments. They're not consistent at all with the instruments that they used. All the objects and tools and non-musical instruments that they used as well are totally random. And they use them in this kind of violent way to concoct a freeform chaos, this really kind of alarming concert performance. And they were often seen as too much to handle and really had a hard time booking gigs. Nobody wanted to be liable for all of the damages that they would cause to themselves and to the audience and to the venue. Like, they would push sound and performance this act of defiance outside of musicality and outside of acceptable spectacle by performing these concerts that would like really consist of literally throwing like oil barrels on the ground, stacking them up, hurling them at people, jumping off of scaffolding onto the ground, using power saws, swinging them around on their back. One time, like the one member of the band used a chainsaw. Like he cut his leg by accident. They'd break glass and spill fluids all over the place, slip around, fall on purpose, and like I guess their most famous event kind of thing was when they drove a bulldozer through the venue, destroying the bar that they were playing in. And what's funny is that like these performances got pretty popular too, and people really enjoyed this kind of like gallows meditation, this kind of like evil spectacle that they were like fascinated with. And instead of, the same kind of the sense of kind of losing oneself to the formless present that you see in Bailey, this is almost kind of like a low, sinister formlessness, this kind of drop into just base affect, but it's like such an exaltation of it. And I arbitrarily chose their second album for you to listen to, because even though fans of the band and the band in themselves insist that their later work is their best, I kind of take this as a joke almost, because like I don't think that this kind of musical product can exist inside of a system of evaluation where you're like, oh, this is better than this one. Like it's really difficult to rank a bunch of distorted screams and wails and grinding feedback walls. Like it just doesn't make any sense. So I chose this one. It's quite raw. It's quite disorderly. It's kind of very chaotic, yeah. And it's definitely confrontational, that's for sure. And if this work is to continually exist as an act of confrontation outside of the moment of its inception, I think what it really confronts is your own complicitness and participating in an enjoyment of it, for once, but also I find that my enjoyment also comes from stopping listening to it. And a few other people I definitely know think the same thing, where it's almost kind of like an overstimulation machine, and like subjecting yourself to like it's like immersion therapy or something. Like it is a tool that can like really reawaken your enjoyment of everything else afterwards, because it rearticulates yourself to like what sounds you're usually listening to. And this band didn't exist for very long, and I think that's for their betterment. I feel like a continual kind of expression in this way kind of loses its force. But there's lots of musicians that are still producing noise these days, and the last 4 albums that I have listed on the syllabus and have included for you to listen to are contemporary noise, basically. They exist as a genre bracketed by the genre of noise music that didn't really exist in the past, except when retroactively applied to these different musicians. And I think that there's something interesting about contemporary noise and the fact that it's very unspecific, both in its actual content and its socio-cultural ties. But it still has this kind of context of genre. It can be kind of easily identified as like, oh yeah, that's noise music, or like that's sound art kind of. It's like experimental stuff, but it doesn't carry the formal qualities of experimentation. They're very, very different. And I think it helps, or it's meaningful that these things are being produced in a context of a very technologically advanced and hyper-mediated planet that's just completely kind of encased in late capitalist globalization, the internet is like a very, very important tool that's been used to kind of foster the continual development of the sharing of this kind of marginal music, this kind of regional and sidelined music that exists also like within the margins of local scenes itself. Like, you know, there's local punk scenes, there's local hip hop scenes, but even more marginal than those local scenes is like the local noise scene. And there's far less a sense of a moment in time kind of being grappled with by these acts rather than the contemporary condition of the move, I think. And that results in this kind of free-for-all, this cross-genre, very multi-fidelity kind of inside-outsider network that exists between artists, but also within records themselves, where like people are really, they are sharing these works on the internet, but they also exist in relationship with the whole history of noise music that is now made available to us through the internet. And the sharing that takes place is really special. Musicians can now share their work from the comfort of their own bedroom or like whatever city and town they're living in, and like feed off of the and be inspired by not just the entire archives of history, but also other contemporary practitioners around the globe. And I think that this kind of coming together, this kind of exchange, isn't new to this moment, but I think the scale that it operates at is. But I think that there's a really interesting specific act in history that encapsulates this kind of feeling of coming together and negotiating directly with each other, that I'm going to turn to now, and we're going to talk about a little bit now. You know, many of these noise acts that have been listed were short-lived. They were kind of intense blasts of attention. They were produced as direct responses to the conditions of a particular moment. And of course, others continued to exist as continual probing of that first instance of disruptive interrogation, only to drift further and further away from that initial intensity, that initial refusal. Others have grown up, gone on to change, abandoned the kind of pursuits that they thought were once vital and changed to other pursuits that they now think are more applicable. And they abandoned their conceit entirely in favor of other styles, even adopting different genres. But then there's one band that really never changed. And I had us all watch a documentary about them this week. It's one band that I really have come to love. I loved them as soon as I listened to them, but I've come to really respect them now more in a different way. And to me, this band is a perfect embodiment of Derek Bailey's governing principle of non-idiomatic improvisation. And as you saw in the movie, and as you read in the text, basically what this band does is it just gets together and decides what to do and how long to do it every single time they play. And this is it's a perfect example of non-idiomatic improvisation. They're not existing within a history. They're not trying to play a particular type of music, and they're playing in this kind of radically open way. This noise making is a form of free play, and the Nihilist Spasm Band, a band which is neither nihilist, a spasm band, or really even a band at all for that matter, but they're nonetheless a collective, are so good at it. They're so good at improvising. And I see them as this really vital suture linking all of these different regions of failure together in space and time through their own persistent practice of refusal. The Nihilist Spasm Band really epitomized this early punk ethos in music, far before punk really existed. And they have a complete absence of standard musical competence, a total do-it-yourself approach. and a complete non-musical noisiness, a non-idiomatic improvisation, and even a lack of improvisation or a refusal of that label at all. And thus, we're met with the inconvenience that they don't fit really into any category. They're not really a band, they're not really music. And the band formed back in 1965, and they still play to this day, even throughout quarantine. There's videos of them online, like playing wearing masks, spread out in a room. It's quite cute. And none of them ever knew how to learn how to play conventional musical instruments. And as you saw in the documentary, they make their own instruments, which are these kind of like fun house or like bizarro versions of guitars, violins, kazoos, and horns. Like they use random objects such as a pot and a marble slowly spun around. And the lead singer uses his own voice in various ways, different but still repetitive at different times. Like he grunts, he growls, he screams, he recites these lyrics printed on a sheet of paper that he just like holds in front of them as if it were a speech, and they often kind of are speeches. It's very weird. Yeah, the volume that they play at is usually very high, but it can get low. They stop in the middle, they can stop, they start talking. It's very cacophonous, it's very droning, it's very rhythmic. It always is shifting up. And the cumulative effect, I mean, it sounds like how you'd imagine. It's like pretty curiously focused, for the fact of the matter is that it's incredibly brutish as well. It's this kind of stubborn trudgery. And yeah, you see them speaking about their own band with a total disregard for any particular trajectory. They play with no trajectory. There's this kind of cohesive dissipation of sense. There's no real care for any type of categorization. They just don't mind. And the slackness is really key. It's like an intrinsic element of what they're doing. They're really just continuing to repeat themselves over and over in this kind of endless shift. They kind of come across as like a mock jazz ensemble. But I feel like the combination of their really inviting, warm presence and their kind of almost humorous methods, their inconsistent instrumentation, and their insistence on not limiting notes nor fully avoiding them, and their real anti-musicianry is kind of a political act. But even though they're not a political group, sometimes they get a little political. I mean, like, they attack nationhood. Like Bill Exley screams against Canada. He kind of jokingly makes fun of his hometown of London, Ontario all the time, but you're never really sure whether they're being serious or not. They're kind of post-ironic in that way. And along with these lyrics that are kind of making fun of the possibility of making a statement in music, are accompanied by these atonal droning chords, these weird detuned bass lines, there's kazoos, there's offbeat pounding drumming, and their messages all kind of come apart. But it almost, the coming apart almost makes them stronger at times too. It's funny, it's like this like punky, rocky, jazzy, but nothingness music at the same time. And this ugly melange points to, a music that is unacceptable and one that's being dismantled. And for me, experiencing this record in my childhood as kind of a fluke, I think just due to my proximity to other rural Ontarian places, it really confirmed my suspicion that the music that my dad was listening to, like the Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd, was like soft as fuck. Like when I first found this record, hearing all those unfamiliar atonal and messy noises made me like first say, this is music. What I'm listening to is music. And all that other stuff is not music. But then it made me say, all that other stuff is not music. This is music. And then I was like, well, whatever. Like, it doesn't really matter. Like, it's all music. But maybe not. I'm not really sure. And I don't think that they're that sure either. It's funny to see the way that, like, other musicians who know what they're doing try to break out of technique and play with them and feel like it was impossible. They're like, so we can't play with these guys. They're too out there. And the other musicians are these virtuosos canceling the idiom of their educational background and some kind of political message. They go on to posit their work in some kind of single focused interrogation of their relationship between sound and noise. Some kind of like head in the clouds theorization of it. The Nihil Spasm Band have this kind of privileged position in the bilge. They take the lowest affect and raise it up. They celebrate the fact that they have no ambition to flee from musicality because they never belonged to it in the first place. And they're not trying to. All they do is get together and define what these concepts mean. Or sometimes they don't even address these concepts at all. All they do is get together on Monday. And that's what I think is so interesting about them. They refuse to ideologically align themselves within the band as a cohesive unit as well. As a group of performers, they almost apply the notion of the non-idiomatic to itself, to the act of not just composing music, but of performing it and of approaching gathering as a band too. They refuse to remain the same. They refuse to let the attempts of free improvisation become some kind of stuck genre. And their creation of noise strikes at something fundamental to it. The way that they gather strikes at something fundamental. The fact that it does not exist independently. As I said before, I really think that noise only exists in relation to what it is not, what is outside of it. And it helps to structure and define its opposites, such as goodness and beauty and meaning. But all of these things come undone too when you realize that what's going on inside is what's also more important. Noise and the music that comes from an engagement with it, and the work of Nihil Spasm Band, work to really test these commonplace notions. And they destabilize them, but they don't leave us with nothing. I find them really inspiring in that they just get together and play, and they have fun. I'm really inspired every single time I listen to them to come up with something to do with my friends on the spot, come up with a new activity to do, and then either don't name it and let it just exist in that moment as like a fun thing, or even name it afterwards and try it next time. And I really hope that you find them at least half as inspiring as I do. And when you go off and make your own recordings, that you really are inspired to let yourself not feel any pressure to perform in any particular way other than the way that you feel like at the moment. And then share it with us and like feel really good about sharing whatever you were able to do. There's no system of evaluation here that we can all share, but we can develop one through consensus. And in the documentary, as the late bass player Hugh McIntyre said, after all, when you eliminate the scale, the key, the repertoire, the category, the traditional rules, and even the breaking of the rules, what is left? We can only rely on each other. Thanks.